introduction. I'm very happy to be here. And like Mitch said, I'm going to be talking about my research interest. And my presentation is going to provide an overview of different projects that I've been a part of, focusing on this behavioral responses to extreme events. And in this presentation, I'm going to motivate the research first, going to tell you how I became interested in this topic of humanitarian logistics broadly, what's my research approach, and then I'm going to discuss these two problems that I've tackled. So everyone here has probably been aware of how chaotic supply chains are in disaster environments. And when you think about the capabilities that we have now, where I order coffee from Amazon and I get it at my house later that day, you would think that we're able to provide assistance to those impacted by disasters more easily. But the reality is that is not the case. And supply chain professionals, like the ones in this room, understand that. The environment after a disaster is not the same as when you're having in normal times where the infrastructure has been affected and all these reasons. So that's the main motivation behind my research. How can we improve disaster response operations? How can we improve the operations of bringing relief aid to disaster impacted areas? And I attack this problem with a combination, like Mitch said, of empirical research and analytical research, and it's all grounded in fieldwork. So I was very lucky to be trained in a research group that has a long tradition of doing this type of research, and I was able to participate in, when I say fieldwork, is actively going to disaster impacted areas and trying to get understand these real life conditions that happen and how the different organizations that are providing relief to the impacted population, what are the different situations that they have to deal with? And what are the challenges that they face when they are trying to set up a logistics operation to bring water, shelter, or food items to people that have been impacted by different types of disasters? And through the past few years, I've been able to go in the field, and that's where the research questions really come up, based on these real life scenarios. And a theme that I found, that we found, and we've published these findings from fieldwork research that I've outlined here, are the complexity that disasters create to the operational theater it comes from many different aspects, but it's mainly because of the dynamics of the situation. You don't have the predictive, you saw how important it is to predict demand based on the previous presentation, to have a clear, quantitative notion of that demand in order to be able to create efficient supply chain operations. And that's thrown out of whack when you have a disaster environment. And there's many lessons that we've learned, but today I'm going to be focusing on the two that are most affected by these emergent behaviors that happen when a disaster strikes. When a disaster strikes, we have a lot of media coverage. There's a lot of, especially large disasters and catastrophes, which is one of the lessons that I have. They're not the same. You're usually more able to respond to a smaller disaster than a catastrophic event. And a catastrophic event is where we really see these emergent behaviors that are not normal. They don't have parallels in normal times. And one of these behaviors, which is the first that I'm going to be talking about, is material convergence. So when disaster strikes, the calls for help start popping up, especially like large disasters. Some come to memory, the Texas freeze recently. There was a lot of, at least in my social media, there was a lot of calls for aid. Hurricane Maria in 2017, Hurricane Harvey as well. So you start seeing all these calls for help, and the calls come also with calls for donations. And everybody, or a lot of people, are interested in contributing and making, helping out those that are in need by contributing some goods that they think will be needed in the disaster area. The challenge that these donations present is that they're all using the same damaged infrastructure that we have to get to the impacted area, the relief aid that is being given by official response organizations. And it's not because it is the official response that's bringing the goods. It's the fact that because of the dynamism that we have in the demand, individuals very rarely know what the priority of the items are. Like, what is it that is actually needed on a given day in a disaster impacted area? And I have one example that Mitch really likes. After the Tohoku disasters, there was a call for, in the media, a lot of people, I don't know if you remember, the earthquake in 2011 and the subsequent tsunami. So the whole town was left without shelter, and all the individuals were in makeshift shelters and freezing because it was in March. So the international community started a call for blankets. And by the time the blankets arrived, it was, the freeze was already thawed and the blankets sat in a warehouse, and we couldn't use them for the response. And that's why donations can be problematic, because these blankets use the same infrastructure that other donations that are of more priority needed to use. And this infrastructure is very limited in this situation. So you would think that this is, a one-off problem with the blankets, but even water can become a non-priority item. And it takes a lot of effort to get it to the disaster area. And those are resources that are being severely underutilized. And that's the motivation mainly of this research. I've been aware of it before, but when I did my fieldwork in 2017 and I visited the impacted areas by the hurricane season, I really got to see these donations. I helped unload a truck with a lot of stuff that I knew what and in the landfill, because it was already here. You need to deal with it. Organizations have to do something about it. So what can we do to get to stop the flow of these donations? We know that the individuals that are trying to donate are doing so because they really want to help. So it's not their intention to create more problems with their donations. And based on that premise, the first stage of this research set out to look at what are the determinants, what makes people choose to donate things, to go to their closet and get clothes, to go to the supermarket and buy canned goods, instead of using your cell phone and donating cash, which would be the preferred donation, because then it can be used to the actual needs at the time that they're needed. So the first study that I did, it's empirical in nature, and we're looking at what are these determinants. And we had some findings, but as you can see from the slides, the key determinants are how close you are to the impacted area. If it's somewhere close, you're gonna be very likely to donate things because you feel like you're close to them. And there's this concept of social affinity and mixed messaging. Because if you see these donations that are donation drives or donation pleas that are coming in your networks or in the general mass media, you're gonna feel like it's your duty kind of to help, So based on this information, we looked at, well, how can we reach this donor, right? This individual, she has all these messaging. She doesn't know that her donations are gonna be impacting their response efforts and creating more problem than they're worth. So we looked at how the information about the request for donations is getting to her, and it's mostly through social media. So we set out to understand how can we get a message to that individual that her donation will be better if it's cash. And we looked at who are the people that individual trusts. In this case, I have a picture of a female, but could be anybody that's inclined to donate. And we looked at from our research, we saw that, well, they looked at local agencies that they trust, local religious leaders. Some NGOs have a degree of trust, and these are what we call trusted agents. Family and friends happen to be the most influential, but these are very difficult for us to reach in terms of telling them, well, go ahead and share this message that cash is better than things after a disaster. So we came up with this concept of trusted change agents. And as you can see, friends and family are the most influential, but there's also other organizations that are very trustworthy, and this is in the concept of the hurricane season, but it could be, extrapolated, and we did the same thing recently with the COVID pandemic. So these themes keep popping up: local officials, people from their community, and also organizations that have that are well known, such as the Red Cross, can be agents of change that are trustworthy. So the goal is to get these trusted agents to post messages in social media, and that's where the analytical research comes in. So I developed a model in my dissertation to understand how many messages do we have to post to reach the most amount of people? Because remember, friends or family are really important. So we want them to be reposting whatever the Red Cross said, whatever the local firefighters said, or whatever local community organization was able to post that message in the media. We want them to also understand that peer effect that is happening in the network, that network influence effect. And that's what my dissertation focused on developing an analytical tool to understand that. And with that, I'm gonna show you some results. Well, I was able to, experiment on the social network Facebook. I created a data set based on a real scenario situation, which is Sandy, Hurricane Sandy, because I had data for donations from that hurricane. And I was able to get some interesting managerial insights about what the optimal investment will be in terms of how many nodes would need to be posting to reach the most amount of people in the network. And in terms of the takeaways of this project, contending with material convergence, one of the key findings is that based on both the empirical and analytical research, the trusted change agents are the key here. So who are these individuals or organizations that are able to be effective in sharing information in a crisis environment, such as a disaster, and as you will see later, such as the COVID pandemic, in terms of operations, donations, and individual behavior that can help manage the operations that are being undertaken. And with that, I'm going to talk about the second topic that I have for today, which is precautionary and opportunistic buying during the COVID-19 pandemic, which is also called panic buying. So since 2020, I've been doing this empirical research into the determinants of panic buying as it relates to COVID. Looking at the literature, panic buying is not something new. And even in our fieldwork research, we already had one of those findings, because we saw it after Sandy with gas stations around the impacted area being left out of fuel because individuals in New Jersey and the tri-state area were stocking up before the hurricane, and there was a shortage of fuel for a few days there. So panic buying it's not necessarily panic, it's actually a misnomer. It is a very rational response from individuals when faced with uncertainty. So if you don't know when you'll be able to obtain basic supplies that you need to sustain your livelihood, you're most likely to stock up to deal with that uncertainty. So what we did to better understand this phenomena is we conducted a survey throughout the United States to understand why these behaviors became so widespread, and we experienced these sites that we were looking at in the media were empty shelves and individuals just flocking to the grocery stores and getting basic supplies. So what we were looking at was after the shortages that happened in March, we set out to understand why we had this big spike in demand that most organizations we have here Snooks, you probably experienced that. And I've talked to other board members that had to deal with some of these situations where, this increase in demand was really came out of nowhere, and their supply chains were unable to deal with that because it was not predictable. And this ties back to that crisis environment where we have, the demand becomes not predictable because there's this external influence of a crisis. So what we looked at in terms of our survey is the survey was still collecting data up until this year, 2021. But I'm showing you here the first 3 waves that we did. One was in April and May, and June, October of 2020. And as you can see here, these are the changes in behavior that individuals reported to us. A lot of them started switching to online, and you can see that in lower quantities and more frequency of purchases. And then we also saw we also asked them what would they thinking that other individuals in their community were doing to deal with the shortages. And so we saw that every individual was really overestimating what the community itself was doing. So they were instead buying more to compensate for that. And so we also collected data internationally, and we saw that even though the more quantity was slightly less than the US, there was also more stability than in the US. In the people that the individuals that responded that they didn't change their behaviors in terms of shopping for basic supplies was more than the US. And also we looked at the effect on their, the quantities of stocks that they were purchasing. And while 40-something of percentage of respondents, 41% of the respondents did not change their inventory, so they keep buying the same. There was, a big significant change in the number of people that increased their inventory levels, almost 40%. Now, same as when we were looking at the reasons for donations, now we're looking at what are the reasons for people going to the stores and stocking up on these supplies. And what we saw is that, there's no panic here, same as I told you before. It's mostly reasons of either self-preservation that are related to, I have a need. Now everybody's at home, so I do need more things to keep them fed and clean, etc. Or it's more convenient for me to buy more or buy online. These are the reasons for the changes. There's also, the risk associated with the crises, or whatever my friends and family are doing, or I have anxiety, etc. Some minimal are either doing it out of altruism to donate these supplies to people in need, and there's some less than around 1% that could be doing it for opportunistic reasons, for resales and price gouging. And these are the results in terms of the importance. Like I said, the key takeaway here is that it's not panic related. So that's why we propose the term disaster related buying behaviors instead of using panic buying. And what we looked at also in terms of what can we do to mitigate, this situation. There are many ways to manage the demand. So same as with the donations, where we're trying to manage that supply influx, that it's voluntary. Here we will be trying to manage that demand. And while we could implement rationing schemes, we know how, people here can attest to that would be very hard to do. And it's not likely to be affected because that, the propagation of information is going to be already happening. So we can do appeals, the same technique that we use with the donations, of appealing to individuals and identifying who is going to give that message that this is the best for everybody if we just buy what is necessary instead of stocking up. Because, and the messages is another line of research. What can we tell? But I don't have time to go into that today. I'd be happy to talk about it later. So and that could work based on our research. Around 88% will be willing to change their purchases if they're explained that this will be contributing to the community. So the key findings, like I said, this is not the result of panic. They are very rational behaviors, and what our best course of action to mitigate the impacts of these emergent behaviors in crisis would be messaging and identifying who are the key change agents. This work was done with collaborators at Rensselaer and Columbia. And I thank you very much, and I would take questions now. Yeah. Go ahead, Mitch. Mhm. So in the second phase of the last COVID, same thing as before. Oh, sorry. So yeah, I need to remember that. So Mitch asked, in the context of the COVID pandemic, who are trusted agents? And we found that friends and family are highly trusted, and also local agents, namely agents that are in the community of the individuals. Yeah.
Hello. I have a question around the pandemic affects people's behavior. So you mentioned one of the category where people change behavior is in changing retailers. I'm curious what kind of patterns you observed in that category.
We didn't dig deeper into those type of patterns, honestly, but based on the first waves where we were looking at that taxonomy of behavior, a lot of it was based on the fact that a third of respondents were switching to e-commerce instead of buying in brick and mortar in the first waves. And later, we looked at internationally, there were more restrictions in terms of where people could shop, so they would go to different retailers. Yes. It just wasn't, it didn't, sorry. So, yeah, so the question is asking whether private companies are could be considered trusted agents. And the reality is that they haven't come up in the research as far as, but private companies are very important. And we found this is just a high level view of the research. So I focus in more of those influential processes. But I've really looked into the private donations, and they are very important. So establishing those relationship with private companies, they are very important, and they play a big role in crisis environments. Keith, yeah. Yeah. I can't tell you, yeah. I can't tell you So Keith is asking about overlap between trusted agents, and I'm sorry that I don't memorize it, but we have a whole section of that in the paper. So I'd be happy to share it with you, because there is a lot of overlap, and we looked at those combined appeals and how would they look like, and who are the best, what are the best combinations to reach out. So I'd be happy to share that with you. Mm-hmm.
Have you created any strategies to get to those trusted sources in conveying that message that really cash is a better option than cleaning out your closet.
Yeah, that's the research part that I'm starting right now. So I'm starting to develop those messages, and the goal is to later look at behavioral experiments to see which messages are more effective than others. So that's a great question, is the next step. Thank you, everybody.